Mr. Gross is going to join us by Skype, modern technology. Thank you very much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Okay, let me start with perhaps two economic facts, which I find very important to keep in mind in the current crisis. The first one is, of course, that Greece still has a very large current account deficit, which means that the economy, for the time being at least, cannot survive without additional inflows of capital. And the second fact is that in Greece, GDP, income, consumption, all have gone down a lot, over 10, sometimes 50%. And it is very strange that the current account still exists. And that's very important to keep in mind, because it means that somehow in Greece there has been a lot of economic pain, but very little gain in terms of financial independence. And that is, in my view, at the core of the current political frustration on both sides. There's, of course, understandable frustration in Greece. The Greek people can feel that they are much worse off. And there's frustration on the other side, in Europe, which is that, yes, we have given Greece a lot of money. Greeks might not have done a lot of adjustment, but the key thing which we wanted to have, at least in my view, which is that Greece could be financially independent as a country, that aim has not been reached. So right now we are at an impasse. The Greek economy needs further capital. The Europeans will provide this capital only under certain conditions, and certain political forces in Greece say these conditions are not acceptable. And it's very difficult to see a way out of that predicament in the current situation. The question whether Greece remains in the euro is really, for me, only a backdrop to this more fundamental issue of where the resources will come from to sustain the Greek economy. And therefore, I can only say that unfortunately further adjustment will be needed in Greece, and that the key issue is really not so much, for me at least, the fiscal deficit, but much more how much the population is still willing and able to consume and to invest. And then the key element, which should be really the basis of any growth strategy, which is exports, which should be really fostered and sustained by any means possible, because that is really what Greece needs in the end, more exports. And unfortunately, so far, results are not very good. Export growth so far has been unsatisfactory. But that really, if I were to give one piece of advice, would be the key area on which the government should focus on, and namely how to keep, how to provide the economy with a broader export base. In the shorter run, there's of course a question of the stability of the banking system. That has been a problem which one could have seen coming for months and years almost, and that is really at this point a problem that can only be solved by the new government. One could of course think about some European moves to stabilize the banking system, but those moves can come only in the context of a Greek political system which is really determined to stay in the euro. Otherwise, Europe can do very little for the Greek banks. Dimitri, let me perhaps stop here, and if there are any questions, I might take them right now.
You are the first speaker. The audience, has not warmed up yet,
okay.
And you sober us up as a start. Thank you very much for taking the time. We know how busy these days are in Brussels, and maybe we can. Wolf, you have something to say, or no? We can go live. Thank you very much, Dan, for this intervention.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here in Athens, and of course a very challenging time for us in Europe, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to give you a German perspective on these developments, because that's, I think, why I was invited by Susanna Vogt to come here and to give you an idea what happens in Germany, what is discussed in Germany. We don't know yet, and it comes out quite clearly every day. We don't know yet where Europe will be in 5 years. We don't know yet in Germany and elsewhere whether Europe will continue to be cooperating in a united fashion or not. This is something that, of course, requires intensive debate, and I would like to look at 3 points, just as a point of introduction. First, I would like to look at the old Treaty of Maastricht, which is still in force, I should remind the audience, and I would like to point out why, from a German perspective, this has been a good contract and a good treaty, and why we should probably think about a return to that. Then I will look at the question, which is probably of most interest to you, why the Germans are so stubbornly opposed to transfers. What is the reason why the Germans are as mad as they are, if you want to call it like that? At least that is what the Anglo-Saxon press says every other day about this issue. And then I think what will be crucial is what will the International Monetary Fund do next week. This is the trigger that should be considered. First, on Maastricht. I think from a German perspective, the Treaty of Maastricht has been a good treaty in general. It has flaws, but it has been a good treaty. It acknowledges that Europe is a collection of very diverse societies. This is something we should not forget when we talk about the future development of the European Union. It is different to the United States. The United States was founded on basically on an empty territory. The existing culture was kind of pushed aside. This is not Europe. Europe has a rich history, and the diversity of Europe has in the past been a strength rather than a burden. So I think this is what the Treaty of Maastricht encapsulates quite good. Of course, the legendary, famous no bailout clause, Article 125, is not just a no bailout clause. It means you have responsibility as a member. You have to kind of live up to this responsibility. Independence in fiscal policy comes with responsibility, and that is, of course, something we should recall. We should, and this is for the medium term, I think many people would agree on that, we should find some way to amend the Treaty of Maastricht. Currently, many people are advocating a centralization in Europe. They are advocating a banking union, or they are banking a fiscal union. I don't think that fits Europe all that well. And there is a great risk, and I will leave it at that. We can discuss that later on. There's a great risk that centralization will reward imprudent policies. And this is not seen very positively in Germany and other countries. Second point, why are Germans so opposed to permanent transfers? And I should say Germany is not opposed to emergency liquidity mechanisms. Germany currently is exposed with a bill of 280 billion in the emergency assistance scheme. So it's not accurate when some Anglo-Saxon newspapers suggest that the Germans and other Northern Europeans are doing nothing. That's just not correct, and also not fair. First, we have to ask ourselves, and we're asking ourselves that, of course, is it legitimate to ask for transfers? Is it legitimate to ask for transfers? And I'm not looking at your country, I'm looking at the big country on the other side of the ocean. I'm looking at Italy. First of all, this was transfers were explicitly excluded in when the monetary union was discussed. German voters were told, well, there will not be any transfers. The second point is transfers, and this is something we see wherever we look. Transfers rarely encourage economic development. Germans don't have to leave their own country to see that. Transfers to East Germany haven't been all that successful. They haven't promoted economic development successfully, and of course, if you look at southern Italy and so on and so forth, this is quite clear. Something that is often not acknowledged in the debate is when I look at the Italian case, and that may come as a surprise, Germans on average are poorer than Italians. The OECD calls that a net wealth position, and the net wealth position of Italians is higher than the net wealth position of the average German. This has to do with real estate that is not worth all that much in Germany and so on and so forth. But on balance, the net wealth position, according to OECD figures, of Germans in 2009 was 130,000 euro per individual on average, and 160,000 in Italy. So German voters ask, why should we transfer money to Italy if that country is more affluent? It is hardly legitimate, and that makes it difficult for Mrs. Merkel. And something that is also frequently forgotten, Germany is currently enjoying a spell in the sun. There is no doubt about it. Germany is, the economy is booming. The question is, how long will that last? Will it last for very long? My take on that is probably not. We will witness a reduction of the labor force in Germany from 44.5 million in 2010 to 38 million in 2025. That's not that far down the road. This is a medium-term development, and we will have to service existing debt, and our debt level is not that low, as you know, either. We will have to service that debt with the population that we will have in 2025. So that fiscal prudence that Germany is implementing is not just a kind of an expression of our preference for a prudent fiscal policy. It is also an acknowledgement of the fact that the country is shrinking and that the country will not be as economically powerful as it is at the moment in 10 to 15 years. This is something which is, of course, to be considered when you evaluate the policies of Mrs. Merkel. German voters, whether one likes that or not, are strictly opposed to additional transfers. Two-thirds are opposed to any additional transfers to Greece. 80% are opposed to joint liabilities for additional bonds within the Eurozone in general. So 4 out of 5 voters do not want Eurobonds. Mrs. Merkel has to live with that, and she has to fight an election, win an election or win a campaign next year. There are, and this is something that in today's Financial Times, Gideon Rachman has pointed out quite nicely. There are limits to the ability of Germany when it comes to being the strong kind of shoulder in Europe. We don't have a radical right-wing party in Germany at the moment, and we should be happy about that. Many other countries do. France, of course, has that. The Netherlands has that. If the instability in Europe will continue and will result in rising claims on Germany, I'm afraid, I'm very concerned that a right-wing party will rise. We already have a conservative historian, Arnold Baring, talking about the Eurozone as, and I quote, Versailles without a war. So transfer obligations on Germany without a preceding war, which is, of course, a very tough language that he is using, but it gives you an idea that there are, in some pockets in German society, the resistance is rising. Final point, what will the IMF do next week? I think one of the rising parties in this country assumes, and Mr. Tsipras in particular seems to assume that he can get away with or he can successfully negotiate with the IMF. I would be very surprised if he would be able to achieve that. I think the IMF has put itself into a position where the IMF can hardly move and can hardly be more accommodating. Madame Lagarde has already positioned herself quite explicitly in interviews. The IMF is under pressure by the Americans and emerging markets not to have a special consideration for the situation here in Greece. And as you know, in previous financial crises, I've worked on financial crises for the last 20 years. In previous financial crises, the IMF has had a policy that has been rather brutal in whether you look at Asia or Argentina. So I do not expect that the IMF will be all that flexible when it comes to negotiations. If the IMF goes, the question is, will the European Central Bank, will the Commission, will other bilateral lenders step in? That is an interesting question. I would think they will not, but that remains to be seen. But the IMF, I think, is crucial, and the question is who will fill the void. We know that the election on Sunday is going to be very important, and I would like to leave it at that. Thank you.
It's quite unpleasant for me to speak about these things in this institution, because this institution represents the Greece of Europe, the European Greece. Konstantinos Karamanlis made a life effort to make Greece a piece of Europe, and that effort started already in 1959, 2 years after the foundation of the Common Europe at the time, and took a long time to fulfill this very difficult task. And I don't want to stay in the past. I want to go to the future, but I think that if we don't see some crucial things from the past, we will not understand the future, and we will not understand what happens now. So we have to speak about responsibilities. And allow me to tell you that as a Greek and as a European, I feel that, as all of you feel, I feel that it's a very crucial moment. It's a very important historical time. And we have to be a little more angry about us. And we have to be a little more critical about ourselves. I will start about Greece. 2 years ago, we had the beginning of the crisis. Everybody in the world blamed Greece for that crisis, and rightly so. First of all, of course, we had the Prime Minister, George Papandreou, that he understood his role by going to the biggest TV station of the world, accusing Greece as a corrupted state and accusing Greeks as a corrupted people. It is something that I cannot imagine that would happen in Germany or Italy or anywhere else in Europe. But anyway, it happened in Greece. This man, who is, of course, Greek people elected as a prime minister, of course, he was elected saying, we have money to give. This is something important. This man negotiated something. After some months, negotiated the construction of a mechanism, a new one, and some treaties that we call them here in Greece memorandums. This is not correct to say negotiated. I'm afraid that I have to say that he negotiated nothing. This was imposed. They told him that you have to accept that under severe pressure, and he accepted that, rightly or not. Greece is enormously responsible for that, because Greece created a state, a huge public service that doesn't work, that it's against any kind of possibility of the country to be something like a European country of the future or the present. But tell me something after 2 years of crisis. Do you seriously believe that Greece is responsible for what happens in Spain today, or what happens in Portugal, or what happens in Italy tomorrow? In my opinion, it's ridiculous to say that. Unfortunately, a lot of people believe that. Among them, it's the German Minister of Economics, Schäuble, that already yesterday said publicly that what happened in Spain 2 days ago was a Greek responsibility because of the Greek elections. I don't want to say more to the Greek responsibilities. I will be happy to answer any questions if you have about that. I want to go now to the German responsibilities. And I want to tell you that Germany and Greece have something common, very common at these very days, that I'm afraid nobody understands. They destroy together Europe. They do the same thing from the different angles, but they do the same thing. They destroy Europe together. Greece destroys Europe with this state, with this public sector, with this extremely conservative way that handles all these things. And of course, Greece is not reliable, but at the same time, Germany destroys Europe now because destroys any kind of trust in a common future. And so these countries, they don't know that, but they work together very closely in another aim that they don't say it, but they do it. They do whatever they can to destroy this common foundation. Why they do that? I don't know. What I know is that from the one side you have Greece that is not able to adapt itself. From the other side we have Germany that wants to rule Europe. Greece is something like a case study today. Germany is very, very aggressive all these 2 years. I want to refer to tell you to remember that Germany was the country that asked the participation of the IMF in the Greek agreement. Originally, the discussion was without the IMF. Germans wanted IMF inside. Perhaps they are right. Today, we face a very big, a very severe, a very profound European crisis. Greece is in the front of the catastrophe. I believe that a lot of people know that. But I call you to understand that Greek people today is dying. Who has the responsibility? The Greek state, the Greek parties have the responsibility. What are we going to do with that? We have two different options. We have to try to make it work, or we can impose things that will never work. What happens in Greece today will be catastrophic for us, but I'm afraid it will be catastrophic also for the common future of Europe. Because I believe that everybody sees that the Greek problem is now arousing everywhere almost in the south. And we will face that threat tomorrow. What happened with the others? And the others are big. The last thing I want to say for the moment is that we have to remember, I want to remind all of us that 3 German ex-chancellors before Angela Merkel, Helmut Schmidt, Helmut Kohl, and Gerhard Schröder, 2 years now, they criticize strongly Angela Merkel for the politics applies in Greece. And what they say, all of them, they say that Germany now has a policy that renationalizes Europe. For me, this is a big mistake. are we going to have national Europes or a common Europe? I am afraid that nobody trusts anybody today in Europe. And I'm afraid that's severe damage that we don't have the time to recover from that very, very bad thing. The economic program that is imposed to Greece, it's a program that nobody in the world, there is no scientist that says that this thing works. From Paul Krugman to Peter Wolfinger, who works for the German government, I think, everybody say, don't do that. Why they say that? Because they want us to have a nice time? They say that because they know very well that it doesn't work. So these days we have elections, and we have Monday perhaps another political scenery in Greece. I hope that Greek people will be wise enough to vote for something that will continue the discussion with Europe. Personally, I believe that even Syriza, who is a threat for many people in Greece now, will be someone of this that will continue the discussion. Certainly, I want to tell you that democracy in Greece is the last thing we have, and it's in a great danger. We have Χρυσή Αυγή, you know that, we discussed a lot about it. Democracy is in danger in Greece. It's the last arc we have alive still in this country. We have to respect democracy. And if there is a fight between democracy and anything else, I strongly believe that we have to defend democracy. With threats, there is no possibility to build a common Europe. Everybody has to understand that we have to find the solutions together, with no imposing measures that simply make people dying. I know that's very difficult for Germans to hear all this. I understand that very well. But I'm afraid that the future will be extremely dark, not only for Greece, for everybody else in Europe. Thank you.
I will also try to be extremely short because, as we all know, the most fruitful moment of those conferences are usually the discussions and not so much the individual interventions. I have 6 very short points, and 3 of them are, if you allow me, already reactions to what has been said. I'm sometimes afraid that not the policy of Germany or the policy of Greece is detrimental to the unity of Europe, but the existence of the euro as such. When you read the essays of Czech President Václav Klaus, who predicted more or less what could happen and what happens now, more than 10 years ago, then you will sometimes be surprised, or I was surprised at least, how accurately he warned against the developments that we are now seeing. And then 2 things to my colleague from to Vima. I take the liberty not to agree with certain analysis of the situation that you gave. One is, I admit, a detail. You said 2 years ago the crisis began. That's a question of interpretation, of course, but I would say 2 years ago the crisis became visible or impossible to hide. It began in 1974 or 1981 or whenever. We are talking about decades here. This is common sense or commonplace, I would say, by now. Secondly, now, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have a lot of people in the room who have been following the crisis from the very beginning. You said it was Germany who began to insist on IMF involvement. To my memory, the sequence of events was similar, but a little bit different after all. It was Mr. Papandreou and Mr. Papakonstantinou who in the beginning threatened that If we don't get our way, we will involve IMF because they were thinking that European Union would not want that. And then all of a sudden they were surprised when Mrs. Merkel and others said, let's go ahead, that's what we want too, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the 4 or 3 points that I would like to point out that I think could be worthwhile to discuss is, first, I think there's no doubt that there is a lot of social turmoil and inequality, and everyone who denies that many Greeks are suffering would be cynical or sarcastic. The question is, where does this, where does the social suffering come from? In my interpretation of the current situation, the burden of the crisis is unjustly split up between the Greeks. We have a certain portion of the society, this is everyone in, I mean not everyone, these are the people in the state sector who have largely profited from an irresponsible governing of this country in the last 30 years. They have mainly caused the crisis, but everyone now in the private sector has to bear the burden of the crisis, and I would find that grossly unfair was I in the private sector in Greece. We have how many people out of work now? 1.1 million. That's the figure I had in my head. And obviously all of them are from the private sector. I find that grossly unfair. You don't have to be maybe as extreme as Mr. Manos and say you have to fire 400,000 people tomorrow, but for sure I don't think it is fair that the only thing applied to the state sector are cuts and not getting rid of some of those people who simply do not have a productive function for the society. So because of the fact that both former big parties, Nea Demokratia and PASOK, have not been willing, because they were afraid of the political costs, to do something about really reducing the state sector, except of this 1 to 5 rule, which we do not really know whether it has ever been applied. Because of this, taxes had to be raised to an unsustainable level, and now the businesses are suffering from that. Secondly, one thing I think could be worthwhile talking about, it is also commonplace to say now, not only in Greece, also in certain mostly left-wing circles in Europe, that the memorandum has failed and therefore should be abolished with. It's not only Syriza. You already hear this in certain other countries out of Greece, and you hear it from, as far as I know, all mainstream parties in this country. I had an extremely interesting conversation the other day. I just came from Halki, where I was invited to a conference by Eliamep, and a young gentleman from Eliamep gave a very interesting speech there saying, how can we say that the memorandum has failed when it has never been applied? It has been very selectively applied. We don't know how the referendum would have worked had it really been pushed through. You all know the examples that we can give about what has not been applied. We know the opening of the closed professions. We know other laws that have gone through Parliament, but we have never seen them in reality. And that gentleman from Eliamep find a very nice picture I found to put it in. He says, a country that has not even been able to enforce a simple smoking ban in public places will of course have trouble in forming much more thorough reforms that have to be carried through now. I would like to give you one example. It was in the summer of July 2010, if I'm not mistaken. It might have also been July 2011. I'm mixing up the sequence sometimes, when the truck drivers were on strike. Was it 10 or 11? And when Papa... Oh, both. Okay, well, that's the logical answer, of course, yes, always. And then you remember Papandreou took what seemed to be a bold step, saying, I will, because it was in the middle of the tourist season, islands were in the threat of not being so supplied with with gasoline, with whatever. And Mr. Papandreou publicly announced that he might even use the army in order to supply the country. Very many people, including myself, were very impressed. I remember myself writing a very positive editorial at the time, saying that Papandreou is really showing political force and political will to change the country. And later on, we had to find out that this was, well, more or less a showcase, because the laws that should have opened the professions were then in the back rooms of the parliament watered down and actually never were never able to reach the effect they should have. I remember there was a German diplomat, I'm trying to put it as general as possible, who wrote me an email saying that it was not only the press that was misled. We were reporting to Berlin in July 2010 or 11 that Papandreou has really been taking bold steps to change something. And we were also surprised to find out later on that this has not been the case. And we have a couple of occasions, a couple of cases, and this, of course, has been undermining trust in other countries. And one last point that I would like to make that might be worthwhile to discuss. As far as I understand, it is mainly, it's supported by all parties that we need Eurobonds as soon as possible. Now, I'm not an economist, but when I talk to economists whose opinion I trust, I understand that had we Eurobonds tomorrow, the interest rate Greece had to pay would have been much higher, would be much higher than the interest rate now being paid under the loan agreement. So I don't really see what Greece would win with this. And then you probably all know the argument, well, why should we have Eurobonds again? Because unofficially we had them at the beginning of the introduction of the euro. Because at this time, the borrowing costs for most countries were more or less the same. And we have clearly seen that this has not had any positive effects on many countries in the European Union. Thank you very much.
When I received this invitation, I immediately accepted for a number of reasons. First of all, because obviously it's a huge topic. Secondly, because as a past Karaman List professor in Boston, as a past holder of the Karaman List chair, I was to assist with this, so far as it was really organized by the Karaman List Foundation. Also, thirdly, I must say, because very recently, a few weeks ago, I had presented to an American audience a paper, and I thought I could rehearse the paper here again. Then I heard about this 7-minute rule. So what I did was, initially I had sent Dimitris yesterday, or was it today, a PowerPoint with a paper. But I see that in order to comply more with the norm here, I will stick to my notes and leave the paper there. So if someone, for some bizarre reason, wants to read the paper, obviously I can send them the paper. I'll try to use my 5, 6, 7 minutes now, leaving the paper aside and talking about some issues that have been raised already. Let me begin by saying that, at least in part, what we're dealing with, apart from whether Greece is right or Germany or whatever, is a stage in integration, I think, in which questions of enforcement and compliance or non-compliance and so on are becoming hugely important. And they're becoming hugely important because really, after Maastricht, we had been led to believe that enforcement is important, compliance is important, but the European Union lacked the tools to actually assist in a regime of compliance that would somehow accompany a certain stage of integration in Europe. So I think that we need to keep in mind that what is happening today with the IMF, which was incidentally brought in first by Sweden, in the case of Latvia, rather than Germany or Greece, for that matter, in the case of Greece. So it was outside the Eurozone, obviously. But the first instance where there was strong pressure from within the European Union, not the Eurozone, the Union of the 27, was Sweden in the case of Latvia, and that has been well documented by American researchers. So the reason why the IMF comes in is because apparently we need some sort of external enforcer. It's not just a question of the sums of money, it's a question of enforcement and the extent to which we can enforce rules and agreements within the European Union. And because this is partly a Greek audience, I would invite people to think this very famous parable of Ulysses and the Sirens, right, which has been used by people like Jon Elster to denote what we call bounded rationality, which is rationality in the context of which we know that our abilities could be fallible, could be limited, and so on and so forth, and therefore we try to find a way in which, because of our pre-commitment to a certain course of events, we try to find a way to build a regime of constraints that would help us keep a long-term perspective despite the fact that we know that in the short term we may feel the pressure, for example, interest groups or other impulses that will lead us to somehow, leave the original course of action. So because of the fact that Ulysses and the Sirens does not operate properly, so to speak, within the EU today, because of the fact that the constraints of Ulysses are extremely weak, because of that, you need external enforcers. And I think the IMF has played the role, has been playing the role, especially after the introduction in the European Union with the cases of Latvia, Hungary, and so on, and later on in the Eurozone itself with Greece, Portugal, and Ireland, the role of an external enforcer because of the fact that the constraints of Ulysses are extremely weak. And in the paper which I presented to this American audience, I explain how different ways of approaching what Elster calls commitment theory and constraint theory could help us understand different games being played within the EU. Now, the second thing I'd like to talk about, again, leaving aside the paper itself, which I'll be happy to mail to you if you like, or send it via email, is very briefly, for the next 4 minutes or so, the different scenarios that we're encountering with regard to Greece and the euro. I think it is very important for us to think of Greece and the euro in terms of three main questions. One is, what would be the implications of an exit from the eurozone for Greek stateness, and I'll explain myself in a moment. The second is, what would the implications be for cleavage lines and cleavage politics in Greece, and then the third, which is more, if you like, less scholarly, if you like, is what implications would be for political culture. And let me just, for lack of time, concentrate on the first and the second, which is stateness and European cleavage lines. Well, I think stateness you can understand as a two-dimensional thing. We can speak of stateness and denote strength of the state. Or you can speak of stateness and denote scope of state activity, right? And I think that Greece exiting the Eurozone would result in much, would result probably in state strength becoming much weaker, that is to say, the weakening rather than the strengthening of this dimension of stateness. And at the same time, the much more extensive notion of scope of state activity. So you would have a paradox in which the scope of activity would probably have to be extended, but the strength of state and this particular dimension of stateness would become much, much weaker. If by state strength we mean really what? The way in which you can enforce a contract, the way in which you can actually apply law and order and so on and so forth, then strength would, I would insist, become much weaker. Scope would have to be extended. And because of this paradox, the very essential dimensions of stateness in the case of Greece would suffer. And as a result, you would have all sorts of different cleavages, including what we call in international relations low-intensity conflict. So when it comes to stateness and dimensions of stateness, I think it would be inevitable to think of the implications of an exit from the Eurozone as extremely problematic. The same, to some extent, applies with regard to different scenarios when it comes to party politics and cleavage lines. The final remark I would like to make is with regard to what some people call European cleavage line within domestic European politics. Some of you are aware, perhaps all of us are aware, that obviously even today, European politics, American politics, democratic politics are marked by different cleavage lines. Well, some of these cleavage lines are obvious, class lines, religious lines, regional lines, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, you have the possibility that new lines, new cleavage lines are developing. And in some countries, the United Kingdom, for example, you do get the emergence, very slow, very tentatively, the emergence of a European cleavage line. That is to say, a cleavage line with regard to the position of the country in the European Union. To put this in a different way, it is as if you have a new way of identifying with political conflict. And that way is really whether you are pro-European or against Europe. In Greece, I think, what we're witnessing is the emergence of a new cleavage line, which was absent in the Greek case, and that's a European cleavage, which will, I think, become consolidated in the next 5 to 10 years, and very much depending on what the future of the EU will be, we'll be able to, follow and perhaps analyze what will happen with this particular cleavage line within Greek politics. So to sum up and remain within this particular time frame, I think that two issues to keep in mind and perhaps to watch rather carefully. One is the very fragile dimension of stateness in the Greek case. That is to say, I think some of us already mentioned that there are questions and problems in enforcing agreements, and these questions are not always strategic. As some of you are aware, you get strategic non-compliance in all sorts of different member states of the Union. But apart from the strategic non-compliance problems, you also get genuine problems of enforcement and implementation. In the Greek case, the problems are usually genuine. They are not necessarily strategic. You may get strategic non-compliance in a number of other settings. Most of the non-compliance problems in the Greek case, I would suggest, are genuine in the sense that they are the result of very fragile regime of when it comes to state strength. And this regime of state strength is in contradiction, obviously, like I just mentioned, with the scope of state activity. This contradiction is brought to, I think, to the fore in today's rather peculiar crisis situation. Thank you very much.
We have heard quite a bit of gloom from my co-panelists. Let me start with an optimistic note, in the sense that we have been here before. If we look at the interaction between Greece and the Eurozone since the explosion of the sovereign debt crisis, we have seen a repeated moment of intense acute crisis, May 2010, May 2011, October, November 2011, and now. So we've seen this movie before. Obviously, the stakes are now much higher. The room for maneuver is more limited. The sympathy for Greece in Brussels, and specifically in Berlin, is not particularly high. And also, Greece, meanwhile, has also managed to lose lots of allies. I'm in the business of risk, political risk. The optimism is now finished. Let me start looking towards more the risk here. If we look at the interaction between Greece and the Eurozone over the past 2 years, has been what we call in Eurasia Group the economic of muddle-through, in the sense where we had Greece European partners questioning Greece's commitment to the memorandum, to the structural reforms, and everything else that comes with that. At the same time, the Greeks here questioning whether what they were told to do in terms of the memorandum structural reform was actually feasible and viable. And this interaction has been repeated many times over the past 2 years, but obviously this interaction is not cost-free. It comes at a certain cost, at a cost for Greece and a cost for Greece European partners, in the sense that managing the political repercussion of this game of muddle-through has become extremely difficult. Here, look at the current political crisis on the ground here, and also in terms of Europe, managing basically, in terms of the European policymaker, managing the lack of support, or if not complete antipathy against Greece that is developing in various countries, not just in Germany, but also in the Netherlands, in Austria, in Slovakia, Slovenia, and Finland. So obviously what this means is that this repeated muddle through this kind of game between the two sides has turned now into posturing between the two sides. The Greek calling for renegotiation, and obviously then we can discuss to what extent you want to renegotiate. We can move from denouncing altogether or some more realistic proposition. At the same time, the Europeans every other day threatening to kick Greece out. So obviously this game cannot keep going on forever. Something has got to give in at some stage, and that is one of the key problems here. The other problem that I see here is there is a very high sense of leverage that Greece allegedly has in terms of renegotiating the bailout. The expectations have been significantly inflated over this current election campaign and during the previous one by all sorts of political parties. And actually, in my view, the leverage of Greece is somewhat limited, and we can discuss about that during the Q&A for various reasons. Certainly, the crisis now in the banking sector in Spain could help a bit the Greek case, but not that much. But the reality is that the next government, regardless of whether it's going to be a left-wing or a center-right government, is going to have a huge challenge to meet here. It's going to have to meet the expectation of the people about the ability of Athens to renegotiate the bailout. So from day one, the expectations are basically extremely high. And meanwhile, when you look at Brussels, as I was saying before, I don't think they are in the mood, certainly, to meet this kind of expectation. The other challenge here for the new government is ownership of the program. Without ownership of the program, you're not going to be able to sell it to the public. You're not going to be able to sell it to the bureaucracy, who is supposed to implement all sorts of measures which are being approved in Parliament or elsewhere. And the question here is that if you look at the election campaign, nobody wants to own this program. At the end of the day, it's always referred to the program of the Troika. Well, maybe it's time to consider it the program for Greece. Whether you like it or not, unless you own it, it's not going to work. And by the moment in which you own it and you actually start implementing it, then the leverage of the country to modify the program, to amend it, becomes higher. By simply basically rejecting ownership is not going to work. The other risk here that we are facing in the shorter term is about an accident. I don't think that Euro exit is the most likely scenario, and even if we get into a Euro exit scenario, I don't think it will come as an outcome of a deliberate decision, not taken here, not taken in Brussels or in Berlin, wherever. I think the risk of a Euro exit could come from an accident. The situation is fairly tense, the room for maneuver is limited, the banking sector here is under significant stress, and there is a significant risk in the short term that a poor statement by some politician here could be met by an equally poor statement by somebody in Brussels, and then what is now a sort of bank jog could turn into a bank run. That is now the biggest challenge, in my view, that the next government would have to face from day one. The risk of an accident and meeting the expectation of the people. If they can also add on top of that the ability to own the program, then the chances of Greece making it through will increase. But clearly the challenges are quite daunting. And the specifically daunting more, and finally my last point here, is whether we see the emergence of a weak government. That is one of the concerns that we have as well as a firm when we advise our investors, because the emergence of a weak government could mean that we might have another election at some stage. And also, the question is, more importantly, leaving aside the risk of another election, is that the country could continue to go adrift in this sort of paralysis where everything is on standby. And obviously, the longer this paralysis continues, the higher becomes the risk of a Euro exit of the country. I'm going to stop it there, and thank you very much.
I would like just to move to the questions coming from the public. I would say that let's have 3 questions at a time, and then we're going to sum up the answers depending on to which panelists they are going to be addressed to. Please identify yourself. Παρακαλώ εσείς.
Thank you. I am very glad that a dialogue finally begins. Welcome to the Institute of, I forget the complete title, Light an Hour. And I'm happy and as a historian, glad indeed to hear the speakers being so honest. I will be honest too. I would like to ask Mr. Dieter a question, and each of the panelists, and I will try to be as brief as possible. Why is the possibility of a confederation or a federal bank or Eurobonds or fiscal cooperation in Europe, which is recommended, by the way, by many countries other than Greece, of course, why is that contradicting or cancelling out the uniqueness of cultural differences that Mr. Dieter pointed out before? Also, to Mr. Dieter and to Mr. Martins, how would you explain, or could you give us a brief statement each for your evaluation of the European accommodation of Eastern Germany? And why is Germany so relentless in demanding of Greece, for example, and other countries, to adjust completely to their demands and standards? Everything is a question of degree, of course. I'm all for privatization, for correction of all flaws of the Greek governments, and all the rest of the things that are good structural measures to be taken. But why don't you seem at all willing to acknowledge that there were some things wrongly imposed on the Greek people with these treatises or memoranda? There are some things that need to be adapted, of course, by the Greek governments in order to implement them, but there are some things that are absolutely wrong according to world's economists, and I would agree there with Mr. Malouchos, of course. And to all of the, excuse me, and to the two panelists, the most honest question, and I do want an answer to that.
If you look at the debt service payments falling due this year and next year, they are a mere 20 billion a year, Greek debt service due, following the debt exchange that took place in March and following the stretching of the maturities of official creditors. So the point is that it is cheap to continue providing financial support to Greece. And so obviously both sides have an incentive to continue with the second rescue package. So for example, the new Greek government could go to Brussels, renegotiate some parts of the memorandum, certainly not the structural parts, but perhaps they might stretch the period to achieving a primary surplus of 4% of GDP. Call it a victory, come back home and implement the reforms. So my question to each panelist is, what probability do you assign to this positive scenario? And on the other hand, on the other extreme, what probability you assign to the new Greek government screwing up so badly, perhaps by overplaying their hand in the negotiations, that they lead to a forced Eurozone exit? Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I?
Κύριος Παλαιοκρασάς.
I would like to pose a question to all speakers, if I may. I think if I picked two proverbs to express the European mood and the Greek mood, I would say that the European mood, as we perceive it here in Greece, is expressed by the British proverb of beggars cannot be choosers. The way our political and intellectual leadership continues even in the face of crisis is best expressed by another proverb, let sleeping dogs lie. So my question is, how do you, what could be a catalyst that either Europe or Greece, or I don't know who else, would supply to bridge those two questions. And the final comment, I would like to congratulate Mr. Piccoli for mentioning the word accident. As a former banker, a former finance minister of Greece, and a former European commissioner, I can assure you that the accident may happen any time. And the sooner we all understand it, the better. Thank you.
One more question before we...
Stasinopoulos, formerly with the European Commission. I think, if I recall, Michael Martens made a reference or a comment from another conference why the memorandum is failing or has failed, and whether Greece has applied that correctly or not. I have a question which is looking at that issue in a slightly different way. My question is, can you turn around the debt dynamics and with what all this change implies, reducing expenses, increasing revenues, and carry out substantial reforms when you are in depression like Greece at this moment? I'm wondering whether the big failing of this, let's say, memorandum was Europe did not talk at much earlier time about growth at the same time when they start talking about fiscality and fiscal austerity.
Let me, before trying to answer those very interesting questions, join Mr. Piccoli in mentioning and emphasizing the importance of ownership of this process. I think this is an underestimated dimension of the entire process. I don't know any country which has developed successfully without owning the process. And this, as you correctly mentioned, is lacking at the moment. I was advocating at the beginning of the operations in 2010 that the European Union should apply a model which would have been based on what Mexico received from the United States in 94-95, which was liquidity provision against the provision of collateral, which would have resulted in the ownership of the process remaining in Greece, rather than this very difficult and problematic situation that the Troika, the Germans, the IMF is blamed for the evils of this and the problems of this country. And this is, when I hear the debate tonight, I'm afraid that this continues to be an important dimension of the discussion. And it cannot be, the problems of this country can only be solved by the citizens of this country, and any outside advice is at best outside advice. It can't, people cannot develop a concept where Greece shall be in 2020. And this is a key point which I find is missing in the debate. The question why Germany, and it's not only Germany, are reluctant to implement Eurobonds at this stage. The German position is quite clear. We are not hostile to Eurobonds at the end of a process which brings European economies together. We are against Eurobonds at this stage in order to solve problems that would probably not be solved if Eurobonds would be implemented. To put it differently, and to agree with Mr. Martens' assessment on what had happened in the first years of the Eurozone, we already had convergence of interest rates in the first years of the Eurozone. And I permit me, as this is an open discussion, and permit me to tell you what the differences were for Greece. Greece, in the last year before the convergence process, in 1994, these are OECD figures, paid 11.9% of GDP on interest payments on government debt alone. 11.9% of GDP. This came down to 4.7% of Greek GDP in 2007. This was a golden opportunity, and this golden opportunity was wasted, if I may say that. The same can be said for Italy. Italy paid 10.6% of GDP in 94 and the interest payments of the Italian government also came down to 4 point something. I don't have the figures in the back of my mind. Germany, of course, did not benefit from that because, if I may say that, we had German interest rates to start with. So the interest bill of the German government shrank from 2.6% of GDP to 2.4% of GDP. So the question that we would ask in Germany is, well, why should we make the same provide the same incentive when the incentive hasn't been used in the first place? I think one thing I would like to bring into the discussion is a statement not just by Madame Lagarde but also by the chief tax collector of this country, who has said on the weekend that if all taxes were collected properly, this country would have a tax surplus, would have a budget surplus, and a robust one. So the difficulty you may perhaps understand is, how can you sell to people that are paying their taxes that transfers are necessary to a part of the world where this is not so popular? I mean, nobody likes to pay taxes. That's, of course, evident wherever you go. So this is one of the difficulties that Mrs. Merkel is facing. I do not share the position that Mrs. Merkel or the Germans are interested in destroying Germany whatsoever. This is difficult to reconcile with the developments. It is also difficult to reconcile with the polls. The most popular politician in Europe, not in Germany, the most popular politician in Germany, in Europe at this juncture, is Mrs. Merkel. So perhaps she has many more silent allies than one assumes. Two final points. I think there is a dichotomy out there which is just not correct, and the more often Paul Krugman repeats it, doesn't make it any better. There is no dichotomy between a prudent fiscal policy and growth. You can grow and implement a prudent fiscal policy. Many countries have shown that this is possible. I give you one example. The one country I would like to bring here as an example is Australia, a country which had 20 years of growth, and at the end of the 20-year, well, it's still going on, that growth process, their public debt was down to 13.7% of GDP. Greece's new debt the following year was 15-point-something%. And Australia grew constantly, implemented a very tight fiscal policy. People know that today's debt is tomorrow's taxes, and therefore a country that spends too much will discourage its citizens from investing and from consuming. I think it's a false dichotomy. Krugman says it time and again, but he fails to provide sufficient academic evidence, and I do not think that there are not other economists out there who say that a prudent, long-term, sustainable fiscal policy is the key for successful economic development. Thank you.
Professor Lovedas.
Thanks. I'll be brief. I'll begin by saying that I agree that cheap credit was obviously an opportunity that was missed for countries like Greece. I mean, the access to the euro obviously led to cheap credit. Cheap credit was not actually utilized in a way that could be utilized. But then I'm afraid that there are problems with the notion that the only problem that Europe today faces is economic or fiscal. Obviously, part of the problem that Europe faces today is its own very institutional architecture. And I think that to talk about Europe as if it is only a question of finding a way out of the present crisis misses not the point, but part of the point, which is that Europe is becoming a politically stagnant sort of political creature or set of institutions. So I think it is a bit narrow-minded to simply focus on a way in which one should really tackle the current crisis, ignoring the fact that given analogous conditions in 5 or 10 years from now, you would have similar crisis or worse crisis unless you had, and to some extent this brings me to your question, unless you had the opportunity to really rebuild some of the European institutions. Final point, obviously in cases like Greece, which is a complex and extremely difficult case, but also in cases which are less complex perhaps and perhaps even less difficult like Ireland, it is primarily a question of the Irish people and the Greek people to solve their problems. There's no question about it. But Europe has become some sort of informal political system. And therefore, the way in which we interact has to be taken into account when we pass judgment on other people's strengths and weaknesses and so on. So it's a question also of political architecture and the accompanying political culture. And this narrow-minded focus only on the way in which the current crisis can be tackled does not really help, I think. Thank you.
Let me take a quick go at, let me start with Miranda's question. Yes, it's cheap financing. The question is moral hazard at this stage. I totally agree with you, given the amount of money that will be required over the next 2 years, the cost seems, but the cost I don't think is more on the financial side, it's about setting an example and taking the risk of having this continuous drag-on effect created by Greece, when especially I think in Brussels at least, I don't have much visibility on the MF side, you certainly have more than I do, there is certainly a strong sense of tiredness with Greece. They simply want to move on because so much effort has been spent on Greece. The challenges are mounting. Look at Spain. Portugal will need additional financing this summer. So I think there is an intention there to move on. Which percentage I would attach? If you ask me before the election, I will say in terms of a euro exit of Greece over the next 12 months, the in-house view at Eurasia is 1/3, 30%. We are certainly by far some of the most optimistic out there in the market. I don't think that if the new government here does really badly, it will automatically mean euro exit. There are other tools they can use. The escrow account, in that sense, could be a nice tool to put pressure on the government. The Troika could provide financing only to pay the external debt and leave it to the government here to find the money to pay for the civil servants' salaries, the pensions, and so on. That will be one way to put pressure on the government before jumping to more draconian, drastic solution. One point about the IMF, I understand that Mr. Thompson is by far not the most popular figure in this country. I think the IMF was brought in not just to be an enforcer, not just to put some money, because at the end of the day, if you look at the new package for Greece, IMF contribution is minimal. The IMF was brought in because of the expertise. The European Union has never done anything like this in the past. There was no expertise whatsoever on how to restructure economies. And if you look at 2 years ago, at the beginning of the crisis, there wasn't a single tool to deal with that. There was no EFSF, there was no ESM, there was no six-pack, no two-pack, no fiscal compact, no S&P, no LTRO. So at that stage, the Europeans were forced to bring in the IMF. And certainly, I think in some extent, both sides, they found that relationship between the Commission, the Troika, and the IMF difficult to handle because they never worked together before, and they are still at times facing significant challenges there. The final point I want to make, again, if we go back to the point of a government screwing up here, and we go back to the idea of an accident, then the ECB will be on the hook. Because at the end of the day, if we are witnessing a bank run, the only entity who can act with the necessary firepower and speed is the ECB, and that would be the question what the ECB would ask in exchange for providing another round of liquidity to the Greek banks. I'm going to stop it there.
Yeah, I have nothing to say more. I just want to remind that we speak all this time about Greece. Of course, we're in Greece. We face this problem today. It's a very difficult situation, but we have to address the bigger problem. We have to see the big picture. We have to remember that 2 days ago we had the Spanish agreement, and today the spreads in Spain were even worse, I think. I'm not sure. There is no solution in parts. We have to try to find the real solution, otherwise no solution is solution. Thank you.
First of all, I'm surprised to hear, is this a Eurobarometer poll according to which Mrs. Merkel is the most popular politician in Europe? Wow, that's, And
Mr. Tsipras in Greece.
Okay, the most hated in Greece, but it's only if only 11 million hate you, you can still make it in Europe. That's, now, about Krugman, as I repeat myself, I'm not an economist, but I think most of us agree that if you ask 5 economists, you will have 6 opinions, and you will always find an economist to substantialize everything you think of. Even Mr. Tsipras probably will find academics who find his ideas very safe and sound. Maybe not in Europe, but in the University of Havana or Pyongyang or anywhere, he will find people who find that he has a very sound economic policy. Now, one question, if I understood you right, you asked, if I understood you right, how do you reconcile the European accommodation of East Germany in the 90s with the strong position in Germany now against helping Greece? I'm not right. I'm not.
Without the measures that Greece is required, not just asked to take, are meaningless without development and economic advancement. And therefore, more time is needed, some renegotiation, because originally there was no negotiation. I agree with Mr. Malouchos. So my question is, do you find any similarity or analogy in the indulgence of the rest of Europe towards giving time to the two Germanys to unite? Do you find a similarity in that, or do you think that the German situation is such a different thing? And because I didn't have the opportunity earlier, I want to put it in the context of history. You said it comes back to 1974. Why don't we say it comes back to the Second World War, when Greece's treasure was taken by force by Hitler as a loan that is not returned? Why don't you put it in the most general context? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, to begin with this, I have written in my newspaper, after talking to your colleague Hagen Fleischer, that the government has a point here. I am not so sure whether it's the right time now to bring it up, but according to the historians I've spoken to, yes, there is a point in asking this question. And going back in history, of course, is always tempting, but maybe also sometimes difficult. I lived 7 years in Belgrade, and all discussions about Kosovo started in 1389. The Battle of Kosovo, it didn't really bring us any help in discussing today's problem. No, I know. I told you, I just told you.
I was blinded by hand grenade left by the Germans when I was 2.5 years old. So we're not talking that far back in history, we're talking about living history.
Yeah, I just told you before. I wrote in my paper also, after talking to colleagues of yours, that there is a point in this. There is a point in this question. I would still prefer to see it as 2 separate tracks, because it would probably be politically very dangerous to meddle this. And about East Germany, I mean, since you're an historian, I think you might, no, this brings me on one part that we haven't touched yet, and this is the fact that we must keep this process politically manageable in all the countries involved, meaning in Greece and meaning in Germany, meaning in other countries. We will have to organize majorities for the path we want to follow. I will say now something that I would probably not say on a conference in Germany, because it has been mentioned over and over again in the discussion in Germany. I haven't heard it being said so often here, so that's why I mention it. Most countries, of course, in the world, maybe all, I didn't do in detail research on that, have internal transfer unions. We have it in Germany. I mean, we have some Bundesländer who have all the time in their existence always been dependent on other Bundesländer. We have others like Bavaria who for 20, 30 years were receiving more than they got, and now they're also paying more than they take from it. The problem is just the German Länderfinanzausgleich, I have no idea how it would, the German internal transfer union is backed by a national idea. People might not like it in Bavaria and in Baden-Württemberg, but they do pay because, to put it very bluntly, they say, okay, after all, we are a nation, we are all Germans, and we have to help Mecklenburg-Vorpommern and Bremen and so on. Now, like it or not, we don't have European identity, at least not an identity that, of course, we have one, but it is not developed as strongly as the national identities we have, 27 national identities we have in the European Union. As long as we don't have that, I don't see how a transfer union could politically function. It will always be the easy prey of populists in the various member countries. And one word about ownership, which has been mentioned here. No one wants to be the owner of the memorandum process in Greece right now, for obvious reasons, because if you declare yourself to be the owner, you will end up like Stefanos Manos getting 2.5%, not make it into parliament.
If any.
Sorry?
If any.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, exactly. But of course, I do agree. Right now, I don't see the parties and I don't see the personnel who could become credible owners and successful owners of this process. Mr. Karamanlis, the older one about whom we spoke, was, to my knowledge, the only Greek who received a very prestigious, maybe the most prestigious honor or prize that Germany has to offer. This is the Karlspreis in Aachen. Yes, exactly. I didn't know that. Oh, yeah, that's him, exactly. That's him giving a speech. The speeches of the nominees or of the people who did get honored with this prize are online. Mr. Karamanlis, I think in 1979, but I'm not sure, 1978, when he got the prize, gave a very impressive speech that is worthwhile to read because he was reminding us, Europeans at the time, of the fundamentals of Europe and why we do make this effort. This has become largely forgotten, and I must say, allow me this as a foreigner to say, I don't see a second Karamanlis. I'm not even talking about names here. I don't see anyone after him who had the guts to take ownership and sometimes also to take not so popular decisions in order to steer a country through rough seas. I just don't see the politician in this country who would take actually ownership of this process. Maybe he's going to emerge, but we don't know that. And again, about growth, I sometimes have the impression when we talk about Greek economy, we are talking about a balloon that has exploded, and a balloon will not grow. You must find an entire new balloon and start from the scratch.
My name is Dimitris Keridis, and I will go straight to my questions. First, to our German colleagues. The criticism against Mrs. Merkel is not that the German taxpayer and voter is against fiscal transfer, etc., 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 and so she is constrained. The criticism against her across Europe and the world is that given this being the case, Mrs. Merkel has failed to make the case to the German voter that Germany benefits from the euro a lot, that Germany has benefited from the crisis so far with very low interest rates, almost negative these days, and that unless it pays something back, then the euro will implode to the detriment of the German economy. The criticism is that she has allied too closely herself with Bild and German populism. And given the very strength of Germany, this has very dangerous consequences for Germany and the rest of the world. So given that, I want to have your response, A. B, in regards to the Eurobond, we tend to forget, first of all, the Eurobond will happen at some point. There is no way out of that. The question is when and what are the consequences? Now, today, we have voted in a very enhanced fiscal pact, a very strong stability pact that it failed in the past. Now, given that, then the logic of Eurobond becomes evident. If we have the one, we must have the other. We did not have that 10 years ago. Instead, we had a very loose stability pact that became more loose due to Germany and France. And finally, given the fact that we have elections coming ahead, I want to ask Wolf and the other foreign guests of ours about what is going on in the Greek public debate. We have a party making a claim for premiership, Syriza, saying that this is a nuclear war, that the Greeks have nukes, that they can trigger the same way the Soviets could during the Cold War. And I wonder, how do you take that in Europe? What do you respond? How credible it is the fact that no matter what we do, Europeans will continue to finance Greece because they have so much to lose. And I want you to be very clear and very straightforward so that we hear it clearly and credibly for once in this very convoluted political atmosphere of ours these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm reluctant to speak, and I have to say that I'm speaking strictly on a private capacity. But your remarks made me say, you said that Mrs. Merkel failed to convince German voters that help for Greece is necessary. it is nearly the complete political class in Germany which supports help for Greece, except for one party, which I don't want to name now. So you are wrong in saying that it's true that the population doesn't follow her. I think it's a sign of considerable political courage of Mrs. Merkel. It's no populism at all. Second, and the gentleman from Dovima said all economic experts in Germany disagree with Mrs. Merkel. It's one of these unfortunate generalizations which you have sometimes here in the public. You have a multitude of at least views on how to deal with the crisis in Greece. And there are only a small sector, including Bofinger, who is a brilliant man, but on the other side we have Mr. Sinn, who is equally the only one who the economic European policy and considerations of Greek internal policy within a framework is Mrs. Merkel with and the governance policy. And allow me a small remark. Everybody agreed that ownership for the memorandum is necessary. And then, I think rightly so, you mentioned Stefanos Manos. And everybody laughed. He had only 2.5%. It's a pity. You agree in principle, but in concrete, you disagree and think it's ridiculous. It's really a pity.
Going back to the question of ownership of the program, I have to confess, as a historical economist, that I think, speaking from a pro-European perspective, that it's a very big mistake that we continue the discussion about the memorandum, who is for the memorandum or against it. I think that a political manager at one of the pro-Europe political parties in Greece should turn the table and should put to the question, how do we Greeks want to eliminate our budget deficit? And we should start a discussion about this issue, because we cannot lend anymore. So we have to find ways to finance our future. And then our European partners, how far can they go and they can assist our efforts to bring our house back into order. I think that the way the discussion has been led in Greece and the two camps, for or against, is totally disastrous for the European cause, both in Greece and in Europe.
Yes, thank you. While we're waiting for an accident to happen, more or less, I wanted to ask you, we know that the IMF had not completely agreed with the first plan and had some other ideas how it should develop. And we also know that with the plan, the second bailout plan, also the IMF had strong disagreements. And effectively, we know that we expect for even an official sector involvement at some point. Still, it was a political decision that the IMF had to take in order to go through with the second bailout program. So it's about all what the politicians will decide. Effectively, we have an issue of leadership. And as Mr. Martin said, there is a political issue of leadership in Greece. So I want to ask Mr. Lavdas, how does he see the political culture to develop in a way that we can achieve this political fortune in Greece to do that? And also Mr. Piccoli, how he sees the leadership in Europe. Does he count that even if we have Greece as a failed state, or maybe if we have a bigger Europe, what is, because we listen to Mrs. Merkel, we listen to Mr. Hollande, but there is little role for Mr. Van Rompuy, for the Commission, and if we ask, most of the people don't even know that the name of Mrs. Ashton, the Foreign Minister of Europe. So how do you see this being evolved in the near future? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution from the public. I would like to ask the participants, the panelists, for final remarks, but I would like to ask you to be very, to have very short remarks, because we are really running short of time. We have to conclude our meeting. Thank you very much. Let's start with George Malouchos.
I would like to mention what you said before. I fully agree with you about the national criteria. This is the real problem of Europe. We have to solve that in a way or another. We don't say the truth. The national criteria still exist. I don't want to blame anyone. Maybe Greece is a problem, Germany, someone else, but we have to decide in which God we trust. As the dollar said, the Americans said, we believe in dollar, in God we trust that. We don't know what we trust. We don't know what we want, and that is the most important. A last remark. The day Greece signed the first memorandum, the percentage of GDP of the debt was 120 of the GDP. Now the goal, if everything goes by the book, is that after 10 years from now, will be the same. I'm afraid someone has to explain that. Nobody does.
Let me throw here a towel in favor of Angela Merkel. Nobody has mentioned that so far. I think Angela Merkel here, room for maneuver is also limited by the German Constitutional Court. Let's be very clear about that. So whenever she's trying to do policy innovation, which doesn't happen that often, still she has to consider that the room is limited by the Constitutional Court of Germany. We have seen it already in terms of interference on the operation of the FSF, and potentially we'll see more from the German Constitutional Court. So that is an obstacle she has at home. Eurobond fiscal compact is not enough. You need a fiscal union. We are far away from there, and potentially we need more than a fiscal union. In the Netherlands, they retire at 67. In France, at 60. Why a Dutch taxpayer should subsidize a French taxpayer who retired 7 years earlier? Doesn't make sense. You need that kind of change. It's going to take a long time. Nuclear weapon in the hands of Syriza. You asked me to be very frank. I will say I will use the term nonsense, because I cannot use another term because we are in a polite environment. I think the leverage of Greece is limited. I think the preferred option of the EU and Berlin is still to have Greece in, but there is not going to be giving in to blackmail. There is going to be giving in terms of sideline concession to a government which is still committed to the core of the program. Short of that, I think at that stage there will potentially a Greek euro exit sparked by an intransigent government here could actually allow Merkel to make a leap forward in terms of the other mitigation tools that potentially are up in the table. I think you made my point in terms of turning the table. I think you can start turning the table once the moment in which you own the program, you start implementing it, and your leverage to go back to Brussels and Washington to change it will increase. So I think that we totally agree on that. Leadership in Europe is weak, certainly, across the board. I think despite all the criticism, I think I do chapeau to Merkel, because on the other way around, until recently, she was dealing with people like Berlusconi and others, which is not easy. And the other way around, we are talking about an entity with 17 different countries, with 17 different parliaments, and all sorts of election. But it is absolutely true that there is not enough leadership. We certainly don't have the Helmut Kohl, the Jacques Delors, and so on that we had in the 80s and 90s. So that certainly is one of the problems that we're facing. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, 2 points. One, with regard to the political culture question you mentioned. Well, I think that there are 2 elements that are obviously missing, I think rather obviously missing. One is pragmatism, a culture of political pragmatism and a pragmatic approach to things European. I think that's obvious. You don't need to dwell on this very much. The other thing that's missing is the notion that because of this interconnectedness, you have to take into account the fact that other people have also to persuade their own citizens, their own parliaments, and so on and so forth. So you are not, negotiating with specific persons only, but also with in fact, separate European demi that actually, that actually have to be involved in this debate. The second point I would like to make is that, again, the question of political architecture is crucial, because even today the fiscal pact is an intergovernmental pact of 25 states. It's not really part of the Union, okay? So this anomaly, if I may be permitted to use the term, this anomaly is above all an institutional anomaly, and I will not refrain from saying that it is extremely narrow-minded to only see this as an economic issue. The Europe of today is a Europe that is trying, obviously, to find solutions. Jean Monnet famously said once that, you know, the European institutions are the result of the solutions that have been adopted during crisis and crisis situations, which is obviously correct. But still today, I think that the focus is too much on economics, and I think we are missing a lot when it comes to the political architecture. Thank you.
Of course, Germany benefits from the euro. All countries that are member countries of the eurozone benefit from it. Mrs. Merkel tried in a talk show, which she doesn't do talk shows all that often, to convince the German public how important that is. And she said, well, if we wouldn't be in the eurozone, we would suffer the same fate as Switzerland. Now you can imagine that commentators, in particular from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, picked that up and said, well, that is not such a frightening prospect. So it just doesn't travel all that well in the debate to say, well, the alternatives are all that frightening for Germans. Of course, Eurobonds will come, but they will come when they come at a point when we have convergence, we don't need them anymore, because then we will have relatively similar interest rates anyway. So I think this is an interesting discussion. And to pick up, I think it is what the ambassador said is quite correct. In the German public, in the German parliament, have been 80% majorities in favor of support mechanisms. The problem is that 80% of the population is against what 80% of their parliamentarians are doing. And that is causing a tension which will sooner or later have to be resolved. Either parliamentarians convince the public, or the public votes for other parliamentarians. This is the current situation. And at the moment, what is deeply unpopular, I just repeat myself probably, but the idea of Mr. Barroso and others to demand more Europe for the solution of problems that more Europe has created is difficult. This is very difficult, and you will not, I mean, to say we are in the middle of the crisis and now we have to leapfrog forward to an unknown territory, which will be the territory that brings the solution of the current problems, is a difficult project. Last point on the nuclear option. What hasn't been discussed tonight, and what is of great concern to economists, at least those that I know, is not the lack of capital at the moment. The problem is, why is it for a substantial part of capital owners in Greece not attractive to invest in this country? Why are there between 250 to 600 billion, so notoriously difficult to estimate exactly what is out there, not in this country but elsewhere? This is the key question for the future. Why do those people not find it sufficiently attractive to invest that amount of money in this country? Because that would solve a lot of problems. I don't think that a Greek exit of the Eurozone is a nuclear option. I think it's closer to Y2K, if you remember what that was. There was a big fuss about it, about this computer bug in the year 2000. Our power supplies and electricity would be cut off, and not all that much happened. So it is certainly not a preferred option in anywhere in Europe, but it is also, I mean, it's a long discussion, what are the benefits and so on and so forth. I don't want to go near it, but I don't think that the rest of Europe is in a position to tolerate sustained the sustained use of that perceived nuclear option, to put it diplomatically. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see a former colleague of mine is moderating, so he allows the journalists to have the last word, which I'm not even insisting on. First, I think it's completely okay to criticize Mrs. Merkel and or Berlin and the German government on their approach. Discussion and criticism is a part of what Europe should be. But I do find it a little bit unfair to say Germany hasn't done enough, considering the amount of money that has been going back and forth between various countries. Look at the fact, I mean, look at how much money Germany has given and at how much, not only Germany, also the Dutch, the Netherlands and others are risking in case this process is going to derail. Of course, as a journalist, I cannot not say anything about the nukes and Mr. Tsipras. One unfortunate effect of the crisis, I think, is that the way in which we speak about each other has become very aggressive. Can you imagine those kinds of statements, Germans about Greeks, Greeks about Germans, 5, 6, 7 years from now? No, it was completely unimaginable. I think it's not exaggerated that we say we are in the biggest bilateral crisis, political, not only economically, between our two countries after World War II. Of course, this cannot be compared. This was a completely different thing, but we are in a deep crisis. Now, if I would have to answer Mr. Tsipras, then allow me to use the same polemical style that he finds suitable. I would say, yes, Mr. Tsipras, maybe you have nukes, but you don't have rockets, and the only city you can drop your nukes on is Athens. Do you want to do that? I'm afraid he would. About Germany and France being the first countries having broken the stability, the Maastricht the criteria for the stability of the monetary zone, yes, that's true. Does it help now to point this out? Well, maybe it does. I always keep thinking of your former Prime Minister Papadimos, who said entrusting the stability of the euro and the keeping of the rules to the finance ministers of the member states is like giving the key of a minibar to an alcoholic and saying, watch out that no one takes anything from it. And last is a very personal observation that hasn't been brought up. I've been traveling a lot through Greece in the last couple of months, trying to see whether in the provinces, in the little towns, or the islands, atmosphere is different from Athens, which I think it is. The crisis is there, but the atmosphere is much better there. But one thing that I encountered very often when we talked about the crisis of political leadership is that many people, one of them being the mayor of Delphi, just one of the persons I remember, told me, what a pity that we in Greece don't have a man like Recep Tayyip Erdogan, because then our situation would be much better. And in this moment, when I understood that many Greeks are longing for a man like the Turkish Prime Minister, I understood that the crisis really must be very deep.
I would like to thank the panelists from Greece and abroad for being here with us tonight, and of course the members of the public who have been very active in supporting this meeting and asking questions. Before we conclude, I would like to make some remarks by saying that I noticed that despite the fact that we overstepped the allotted time, hardly anybody has left the room where we are meeting tonight, and this is a very clear evidence that the discussion has been very interesting, very lively, very controversial, if you like, but this is actually the meaning of discussions and meetings like this, especially in very difficult situations, very hard situations for my country, like the one we are living through now. And certain questions have come up, of course, very important questions. I would like to start with one of it, which is actually more a statement than a question. We have been discussing about the ownership of the program, and I said before that actually this is a way this issue is being discussed that I don't agree with. Actually, what we have to do in this country, we must want to do it ourselves. The reforms, the changes which are overdue, and actually we may be criticized, some of us as politicians, that we have been too slow by implementing changes, but from our part, from the party I'm belonging to, or from the party I've been serving, we have done not, maybe some people can say not the best we could do, but we have done a lot. And we think that in the upcoming elections, that's what we're doing, we're saying to the Greek public, that they have to make the right choice in order to avoid Greece stepping back into 20, 30 years ago. Many people seem to have forgotten how Greece was 30, 40 years ago. But myself, having been a journalist for over 30 years, as I was saying before with the panelists before we entered the room, I have very vivid memories of what Greece was before joining the European Union. And since almost all of the panelists seem to agree that it would be a disastrous development for Greece to exit the Eurozone, I think that all of us in the political world, in the business environment, we have to do our best in order to secure, with the help of our partners in Europe, Greece staying in the Eurozone. Because, as somebody said, more than one of the panelists said, some of our partners seem to get tired of us. We have been promising too much, and of course, they don't have the obligation to see the difference between the one government and the other government. They have been negotiating with the Greek government, the elected Greek government, and they have been expecting the Greek government, which is in office, democratically elected, to do whatever it has committed itself to do. Sometimes I have the impression, and this became also clear during tonight's discussion here, that we are inclined to have a fist fight with each other. Here in Greece, we are using sometimes words that are pointing towards this direction. For example, TV debates between political leaders. In other words, they are just called TV debates. Here in Greece, we are calling them telemachia. It means TV fight, because we have to fight with the other side, and we don't think very much about trying to convince them with convincing arguments. This is something we still, I would say, have to learn to do while negotiating with our partners, while talking to our partners, while trying to convince our partners that certain modifications, important modifications to the program which we have to implement, we must want to implement, must be done. I hope very much that I thank both the Karamanlis Foundation and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for giving us the opportunity tonight to be here and discuss this very openly. And since it's my inclination very often to renew invitations, I haven't been authorized to do it, but this is just an idea I would like to table, is that it would be a very good idea in 6 months' time, 9 months' time, it's not up for me to decide, to be here again and to discuss anew the same issue, which is the Euro future of Greece. If this is the case, and we are able to discuss this issue in 6 or 9 months' time, then it's going to be a very clear indication that we are on track. If it's not the case, I don't want to think what will have happened to Greece by now. On this happy note, because I want to be an optimist, I would like to thank you all for being here with us tonight. Thank you very much.